This is part 2 of the two-part tutorial covering a screen fade solution in the universal render pipeline for Unity. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, then I highly recommend you watch that before continuing into this part. I'll have a link here and in the description to that video, and don't worry, this one will still be here when you get back. So in part 1, we covered the bare bones of the screen fader, how it was set up as a render feature, and also we added some polish to how it worked to make it look pretty nice and fancy. So let's crack into part 2, where we will look at manipulating that screen fader with the timeline, which could be useful for things like cutscenes, QuickTime events, or some other transition. Now I'm not going to go over the previous code in doing this. I'm going to crack on straight into the new code, adding on to where we left the screen fader previously. So let's start by taking a look at what we've got. And we're using the same asset as we did in the part 1 of this tutorial, and that is the ArchVizPRO Volume 3. And this asset is available in the asset store, and I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to get it to start running zombies through walls or even building a real estate application, which is the sort of thing we're going to show here in this demonstration. Now, we're going to open up the timeline because that's the point of this tutorial, and we're going to see that we've already got some animations set up on the timeline itself. And what these animations do is, if I switch to the game view, is they just rotate our camera around each room in turn, giving a sort of presentation of this apartment. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually have the screen fader work between each of these rooms. Now, you've probably watched part 1, and if you haven't, go and watch it and come back. In that part, we actually teleported between each room. And in doing so, we set off a screen fader. So we'd start in the living room, we'd press on a button to trigger the teleport, that would fade us to black, and then once we entered the kitchen, we'd fade out from black into the kitchen view. And that was the progression of part 1 of this tutorial. Now in this one, we're actually going to stick elements on the timeline for the screen fader that will allow us to control how they actually fade each time we switch rooms. And we're going to do that in 2 processes. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set markers. We're going to have a track, and each marker is going to say fade in or fade out with various options. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a clip. And this timeline clip will enable us to actually alter elements, fine-tuning between each part of the screen fade, whether that be the colors or the actual alpha that we fade between. And we'll be mixing those up as we go along. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to work on is the markers. So if we jump into the project view and we look at our scripts folder, we're going to create a new folder in here, and we're going to call this timeline. And under timeline, we're going to create a marker class. And this will enable us to put options on our marker that will be sent to our screen fader. So let's start a C# script, and we're going to call this screen fade marker. Okay. And if I open this up in Visual Studio, we're actually going to derive from the marker class, and that will come from the timeline library. And it's going to be of type, use the interface of iNotification. And you'll see how that plays in when we start sending it to a notification handler in a moment. So let's begin by giving us some variables. And if we remember from our screen fader, what we have is we have a flag that says whether we want to fade in or fade out. We have a duration for that fade, and we have a color. So let's start with, we'll create a field. And this field, we're going to give it the flag. So whether to fade in. And we'll put bool fade equals false. And the next one is the duration. So again, a field. And this field is going to be duration of the fade. Float duration. And we're going to set this as 1 second to start with. Now, the next field is going to be involving the color. Now, because we don't want to do nullable variables in our serialized field, we're going to have two fields with the color. One is going to say whether we want to override the color, and the other is going to be the color itself. So this first one is going to be a flag, whether to override color. That's going to be a bool, override color, and we're going to set that as false. And the next field we're going to actually set up is going to be the color itself. The color to fade. Color, color. And we're going to set that to our default color, which isn't white, that's the opposite, it's black. And those are our fields. Now, we'll want to actually enable ourselves to get these fields. So we're going to want to make some of this public, and we're going to want to expose it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to expose the fade, get, return, and fade. Then we'll do the duration. Oops, there we go. And you guessed it, we'll do the override color. And the next thing is the color itself. Great. Now you'll notice that we're getting an error here because Screen Marker needs to actually implement an interface of iNotification ID. And luckily we can get that from some of the marker work. We can actually do public property name ID, and that'll be a new property name like that. And that will be all the iNotification actually needs to work with this marker. Oh, don't know what that button does, but we're just going to get rid of the description. There we go. So let's save that screen fade marker. Now, the next thing is to actually have a track that marker, those markers can be placed on. So if I come back into Unity, I will create a new class, and this one is going to be called screen fade marker track. If I boost that up, get rid of this, because this is going to actually derive from a marker track, which is in the timeline library. Now, we don't actually have to put anything into this. What we're going to do is use some attributes to set this up. So we're going to use track, binding type, type of screen fade. And also, I like to set a track color here as well. And we're just going to set it to something random, like all 0.7s. How about that? Now, what this binding type is actually doing is it's enabling us to enter the screen fade in our scene into the track, and then all those markers that we set up into that track will actually work with that screen fade. If we come into Unity and I right click on our timeline, you can see now we have an option for screen fade marker track. And if I press that, there's that link, there's that binding that we have. And we can drop our camera into there because that's where our screen fade is. And now we can actually create screen fade markers. So you see there said add screen fade marker. And we have all our options. And here we're going to fade in. We're not going to worry about an override color for now. And here we're going to fade out. We leave that as false. Now this won't work just yet because the markers will send a message to the screen fade component, but that screen fade component doesn't have any receiver yet. So what we'll do is we'll jump back into Visual Studio and go to the screen fade. Now in here, we're going to derive from an interface called iNotification receiver. And this comes from the playables library, and it will go bad as soon as we put it in because we haven't implemented the actual method for receiving. So the method for receiving in this is public void on notify, and on notify takes in a playable, and that's from the playable graph that we actually are setting. So in this case, the track graph, an iNotification, which will be our marker, and an object, which is the context. Now, we actually want to check whether this notification is a screen fade marker. And to do that, all we need to do is go if notification is screen fade marker. And we're going to want to do stuff with that screen fade marker. So we'll just set that straight up. Now we have the screen fade marker, we can actually pull the parts off of that screen fade marker, all the variables that are set up, and use that to actually set our screen fade. So the first thing we want to do is find out, did we set an override color? And what we'll do is we'll go screen fade marker is the flag for override color set. And if it is set, then we'll use it, color. Otherwise, we're going to pass null, because if you remember correctly, the fade here, it receives a null in the color if we didn't set a color. So now we can just call that fade, and we can call it with first the fade, whether we're fading in or fading out. We're not going to be doing anything with delay because we're working on a timeline, so our delay would be inherently just in where we stick this marker in the timeline. We'll pass color because that is a nullable variable now, because we're checking whether we're getting the override color or not. And the last bit is to pass the duration, how long we want that marker to last for. So if we save that, jump back into Unity. Now, if I press play, as the camera moves around the world, the timeline will move, and you can see it moving there, and it's coming up to our first marker. When it hits that marker, it's going to send all those variables through to the screen fade, and there you go, it faded out. And when it's finished, it will fade back in, and we're in the other scene. And we could do this, these two markers, and we can actually copy and paste here. We can do these for each part that we actually are interested in. So now, when we press play, we move around the scene, we'll fade in and out as we go from scene to scene. So there we're in the kitchen, and we'll move through to the study. And then again, the last set of markers will move from the study into the bedroom, fading out and fading back in. And there you have it. Those are markers. But now we want to switch to something a little bit more complex with ability for us to fine tune how the screen fader is actually working. And for that, we're going to use timeline clips. We will start by creating 3 classes, a behavior class, an asset class, and a track class. Let's start with the behavior. Screen fade timeline behavior. And then we'll create another class. Wait for Unity to catch up. There we go. Screen fade timeline assets. And also we'll create screen fade timeline track. There we go. So let's open these all up in Visual Studio. There we go. So we've got the asset, the behavior, and the timeline track. None of these are going to be mono behaviors, but let's start with the timeline behavior here. So this is actually going to derive from a playable behavior, which comes from the playables library. We won't need any of this mono behavior stuff. And it will need to be a serializable class, which comes from system. In our track, this is actually going to derive from track asset, which is from the timeline library. And in our asset, this is also going to derive from playable asset. And that will come from the playables library. And again, we won't need any of the mono behavior stuff here. Okay, so let's start in the behavior itself. So the first thing we want to do is we want to expose some properties like we did previously. We'll start with the alpha level. We'll set that to 0. That's the alpha of the fade itself. These are going to be the fades, as if you were doing curves. Sorry, these are going to be the curves that you'll actually manipulate on the timeline. And in this case, we want the alpha, we want the color as well. And we want to say whether we're overriding the color, as we did previously. So the whether to override color. We'll set this as a flag. And last but not least, the color itself. And we'll set that to black. There we go. Okay, now on the timeline, on the behavior, sorry, this will have a method that we'll want to override. And the override that we're going to do here is process frame. Now what happens is the behavior gets called every single frame, and you can do things like when the clip starts, when the clip ends, etc. In this case, what we want to do is we want to look at each frame and then send to the screen fade what we've set here as far as the alpha, the color, etc. is concerned. So the first thing to do is we won't be going to base, we'll be getting the screen fade. And the screen fade will come from the player data. As that will be what is set up in our track. We want to make sure that it's there, so it doesn't equal null. And the reason we check whether it equals null or not is when we're actually using the timeline track, we might not have actually set the screen fade yet on it. And then if we go and run the track, this will process whether we're playing in the application or we're just running the track in preview mode. This will check that the screen fade is set. Otherwise, we'll get errors everywhere. So now we've got the screen fade and we're checking for it. We're going to actually want to set the alpha and the color on the screen fader, but we don't actually have the ability to do that. If we go to the screen fade class, all we have is this fade function here, and that tells the screen fade to black or fade away from black or whatever color we set in there, to delay before we fade, and also the duration of the fade. But obviously with the timeline, we want to say at this point in time, set the alpha to this or set the color to this. So we'll create two functions. One will be set alpha, which will be value, and also another function called set color. There we go. Now, because we're going to be able to run this outside of the play mode in Unity, because we can preview our timeline, this will actually be called. Now, if we actually have straight processing on the screen fade material itself, so if we were to do this, mFade material dot set float, and then say we want to use the alpha and then set the value. Right here, this material hasn't been set because the awake hasn't run and the start hasn't run because we're not in play mode. So what we want to do is we want to check whether we are or not playing. And you can do that with the application is playing check. And we'll actually have something running when we're not playing, and we'll set that up later on. And that will be an editor function that we'll put into the override editor, the custom editor for this screen fade. But for now, we'll just check that we're playing before we actually start setting that material alpha. And the other thing to do is to set the color. So we'll just copy and paste and we'll do the color. And that's all we need to add to the screen fade to work with this behavior. Because now we can say screen fade dot set alpha. We'll set that to the alpha. And then we'll also say if we override, then screen fade dot set the color. There we are. And that is our behavior done for now. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to come into our asset and we want to set this up. Now, you notice this is complaining, and it's because it needs to inherit an abstracted member from this playable asset. And that abstracted member, we type in override, we can see it straight away. It's create playable. And we don't want it to throw an exception. We actually want it to create the playable. So what we'll do is we'll use script playable. And we want to use the behavior here, the screen fade timeline behavior. And this will be our playable. And then we'll use script playable, same thing again, script timeline behavior. And then there's actually a static function here called create. What this does is it takes in the graph that we are passing off here, and it also takes in a behavior, an M behavior. And what we do is we actually expose a field here, screen timeline behavior, M behavior. And we pass that in. There we go. So this will actually create, using the template, a new screen fade timeline behavior using this static function. And then we can actually return that playable. And that is all we need to do for this particular timeline asset. Just create the behavior based on the template we're using. So the last part of this is to create the track. And we don't really need to do anything much in the track at this point. The only thing we need to do is set up some bindings. So track clip type of, and this will actually be our asset. So this tells us what clip types we're going to be creating in our timeline. And then what we bind to is what we're actually set at the beginning. This will be the screen fade that's actually in our world. And to make everything look nice and neat, we'll use the same color system that we did, well, the same color that we did with the marker. There we go. And I've missed a comma. There we are. And that's it. That's all the timeline track needs to do. We've told it that we want to bind to a screen fade, and we've told it what type of clips we're going to create. So let's save all that and jump back into Unity. So back in Unity, we can look in our timeline and we can actually create now a timeline track. Now I have to put this up and we'll get rid of that. Put this up a little bit higher so you can see it. And there we go. Screen fade timeline track right next to the marker track. And when we create that, very much like the marker track, we can pop in our camera here. Now we're going to mute that for the time being because we want to play with the track and we don't want to be messing with it by having clips and markers. Now we can actually create a screen fade timeline asset. And this is where all the behaviors live, all the behavior parts. And we can look at it in a graph view. So this gives us a graph and we can see our alpha, our color, and our overriding of the color right there. So if we're to take our alpha, we can actually add a key and we can make it go up. And you can see the figures there that after 2 seconds, we want to be at 1. Now, what isn't shown a lot in Unity is you can actually double click on this and it will bring up the animation window. And if I can manage to dock the animation window, there we go. The animation window tends to be a little bit easier to build your clips from rather than actually doing very small movements in here, as you can see, because you can actually get the curves a lot nicer and play with it, and it's got a better dope sheet. So what we'll do is we'll actually, when we move, we probably only want to go for about 1 second to move all the way up to 1. And then what we'll do is we'll copy that and we'll paste it at 2. And we'll copy that and we'll paste it at 3. So what this is doing is it's going from 0 up to 1, staying at 1, and then going back down to 0. Now we want to make sure these are actually 1s because they look like they're just under. So we can put 1 there and we can make sure this as well is 1. There we go. So now we're definitely at 1 in between here. Okay, so popping back to our timeline, we can now see we've got our nice curve here. And we can move that to basically make sure we're all faded at the point where that line actually is. So we'll move it about and we can make sure it goes right down there. So now if I am to play, again, the camera will start moving. And as it approaches, it will actually start going up and down on our screen fade. There we go. But what we can do is we can make all sorts of curves here. So you can imagine we could actually go up halfway for a while, then stop, then come back down. So I can add a key here and I can move this out a lot further. Let's make this last longer. So I can pull this out a lot further. Then I can bring this down. I can add another key and I can level out at a certain point. And now if I press play, the camera will move around. It will get to the screen fade. It will fade out, come back down to halfway, and then fade out the rest. So you saw it just fade there at the last moment. So you can do all sorts of these sort of fades in and out across your timeline. So you can imagine maybe doing a wake up period where your player is waking up from a sleep and they open up their eyes fully and then they close it back down partially and then they open it up fully. And you could do a whole like motion of waking up as the player gets out of bed. So you could use the screen fade for that particular purpose. But for us, we just want to jump in and we want to jump back out. So let's put that back down there. Now, as I said, you can also override the color here. So let's do that now. First, we'll say that we're going to override the color in this screen fade. You can see that we have red, green, and blue options. I will add a key here for blue and we'll put it up. And now if I press play, and we come around, you can see that we're going to be fading out, but fading out to blue and coming back. So there you go. So we can actually do all sorts of colors. So I don't know, maybe a hypnotic trance in your player and suddenly you're changing the colors at a regular basis across your screen fade. The point is we are able to do it in this actual timeline editor. Now, one thing that always stands out a little bit weird is the fact that this thing gets called a screen fade timeline asset when really we don't want that. And a lot of the clips that I put in, I actually name them after maybe an object that's assigned to this particular clip, or I name them something a little bit more legitimate. So let's do that now. So let's pop in and we'll go into our track, and under our track, there's actually a function you can override called the create playable, and under create playable we can actually get hold of the clip, and the clip has the display name, and we can use that display name to do something like screen fade, and we could save that. And now when we go back into Unity, when we create clips, they all get called screen fade. And what that done is that actually just redrew the actual timeline, and now everything's called screen fade. Now, that's all well and good, but we do like to preview what we're actually doing. And at the moment, we can't preview the actual screen fade itself. So what we can do is we can actually, like with the scene view, when we press on a camera and we get a little window down here that shows us what the camera is actually looking at, we can set up our own windows that give us the fade level. So even when we're in the scene view, we can actually see when we're fading and when we're not. And I don't like to take up the entire window with post-processing because that obscures me building stuff in the scene view. So we'll build one of those little windows down here so we can actually do that. So let's do that next. The first thing we want to do is we actually want to expose a color. What color is the screen fade currently on? And we'll include the alpha in that color. So to do that, we can create a color preview. So color, preview color, and we can get that, and we can make that a private set because we only want to actually set it within this, and we'll default that. Oh, let's go there. There we go. Default that to our default black. Okay, so now this is where this comes into play, and what I mentioned earlier about changing this to enable us to do the preview color. So down here, we will say that preview color equals value. And here, we will set that preview color, its alpha, to the level of alpha we're setting here. So to do that, we want to get the color from the preview color because we don't want to change the entire preview color. We only want to change the alpha level, and we want to change the alpha level to value. And then we'll set the preview color back to the color. So we're just setting the alpha here. And we'll want to make sure we don't override the alpha every time we do that here. So the value that we bring in, its alpha, we're going to set to whatever the preview color's alpha is actually set to. So we won't override the alpha every time we set the color. Now we'll need to see what this looks like. And to do that, we're going to change the editor that we created in the first tutorial. So we'll come through the project, we'll go through to the editor, and we'll open our screen fade editor. And this is what we created in the first go round. So if you don't know what that is, best jump into the first tutorial video like I've been suggesting and watch that. But hopefully you have watched that, so let's just dig in. Now we're going to do the on-scene GUI here. And what that does is it's actually giving us the scene view that we're looking at, and we can play with the graphical user interface of that. Now we're going to need to get all the various options from screen fade, including that preview color that we were talking about. So let's get that from the target. Let's just set that straight off the bat here. Now, because we're going to be creating a window, we actually want to do handles begin GUI to start that off, and we want to end that with handles end GUI. So what we create will be between these two pieces of functions. And what we want to actually create is we want to create a little window, as I mentioned. And we're just going to give this the ID 2 for the window. And we're going to create a rectangle. And we're going to start this. Now, this is where this is created in the scene view. And we want to have it in the bottom left. So we want to have it down here in our scene view because our camera view is always over here. And we don't want them to overlay. So let's jump back in. We want to make it a proportion of the height for where we actually, so that's getting us the bottom. And we want to make it 140 by 100 in size. So that's setting the X and the Y in on the actual screen, and we're going from the bottom, so height minus 130. We're going to create it 140 width, and we're going to create it at 100. So there'll be a 30 above the bottom, basically there. Now, this will need to send through the ID, and we'll start creating all the style for the window in here. But we'll need to set a title for that window first. So screen fade preview. There you go. And although I'm doing this for the screen fade, obviously this technique of creating small windows in the scene view, you can use this for nearly anything. You can use it for special cameras or render textures or whatever you want to do. So what we're going to be creating in our window is we're actually going to be drawing a box. And to do that, we're going to have some space around it, and we're going to set it to horizontal space, etc., just to make sure it's nice and neat within the actual layout. So we'll put GUI layout, begin horizontal, and then GUI layout, flexible space, and then the opposite, GUI layout, flexible space, GUI layout, end horizontal. And what that will do is it will make sure that our box is perfectly aligned in the middle of our window. So we've got some space on the outside, space on this side, so space on the left, space on the right, and everything's nicely laid out in the middle. Because if you've seen any of my videos, you know I like things to look nice and neat. So here's our box that we're going to be creating, and we're going to be setting the height and the width, and we're also going to be putting some text in here, and we're also going to be setting that text to what the alpha is. Now, the reason that we're going to actually have a value at the top of the box that says what the alpha is because we won't be able to see the alpha on the back of the box. So if I have a black with an alpha of half, we won't be able to see that. It will just look like black. So we'll actually set an alpha level at the top here so we can actually read what it is. Now, the alpha we can get back is not actually between 0 and 1, as you saw from the graphs we done earlier. It could be a little bit off. So what we want to do is we want to actually just put the alpha between 0 and 1. And then we want to pass that to a string. And we want to format that string so we haven't got a shed load of numbers straight after the actual thing. So we don't want like 0.4275 because it's just not going to make sense. This is a preview window, so we're just going to have 2 decimal places. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to pass in a GUI style to this box, and we're going to do that in a moment. So I'm going to leave that blank at the moment, and you'll see why we're going to do that. We want to give it a width, and our width is going to be 100, and we want to give it a height, and our height will be 70. Now, back to this style. The thing is with these boxes is they don't show the exact color. They actually give some of the bleed from the background. And we don't want that. We want this to be nice, pure. That is the color you're screen fading to. That is the color we're going to show. So we'll create a style for that. And we're going to call this tintable style. And it will be a new GUI style. And we're just going to give it default box to start off with. And this tintable style, not stipe, this tintable style is what we will set into the box here. Now, to make sure that we get it nice and white at the back so that the color comes through the exact color we want, we actually need to set the background to this style. So when the style's normal, the background will be the handy functionality of texture2d dot white texture, because this background is a texture of 2D, and luckily GUI Unity gives us this white texture, a titchy tiny texture that doesn't take up much memory that we can use as the background. Now we need to also set the text for this particular box. So the text color we're going to use is also white, so it stands out on top of any color we particularly stick down. But if you wanted to use a different color, you could use red. It's just if this tints to red, then it's going to look kind of odd because you'll lose your text. But you can make it black if you're doing a lot more white tinting. Now, the last thing we want to do is we actually want to set the color of the box to the preview color. But first, we want to make sure we keep a backup of the color that the GUI is currently set to, because this is a static color that's actually set across. So we want to get a backup color, and then after we're finished, we're going to set that to the backup color there. And then we can change our GUI to our heart's content. So our GUI background color, we're going to set that to, yes, you've guessed it, the preview color for screen fade. So jumping back into Unity, and we can see there we have our screen fade preview. This is our preview all set up, ready to go. And what we can do is we can lock the inspector to be our camera. And what that basically does is it means anything I select in hierarchy, this inspector is going to stay locked to the camera. And then I can go to my playable director, and I've got my screen fade here. And then I can come through and you can see the alpha actually happening on my screen fade preview. Excellent. And now if I come in and I change some of the color, so I go to color B, blue even, and then I come up, as soon as I go in, there you go, it's going to blue. So there is our preview to know what's going to happen in our game view. So then if we were to have this in different parts, as we come through, goes to blue, goes to blue. So we can get a preview even in our scene while we're creating. We can see what the camera will see, and we can see what our preview is, and we can still play with our scene and create stuff. This is a really powerful tool to have in our arsenal. And that's it. In this video, I have shown you how to manipulate the screen fader with the timeline using markers and using tracks. But you can also use the things you have learnt here to use the timeline to manipulate real-time light intensities and colours with custom tracks. Or maybe you have emojis showing on a UI you want to switch with markers. It's a powerful set of tools to have in your tool belt to use the timeline to your advantage. Now, I hope you have enjoyed this video tutorial series, and if so, think about hitting the like button. And if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel as well. And as always, thanks for watching.